Welcome back to my channel. My name is Erica, and in today's video I am bringing you another episode of True Crime Sunday. Now, I try to do these videos every other month, but I think it's been at least 2 months since I've done one of these episodes. And if you're new here, you might be wondering why I'm even doing true crime videos on a primarily makeup focused channel. Well, I've always been very intrigued by true crime. It just took me a while to get into doing these types of videos on my channel. And when I first started, I was bringing you cases from my home state of Oregon. And as time went on, I just thought it would be interesting to branch out and bring you cases from all over the world. Now, this particular episode is the case of Robert Hansen, also known as the Butcher Baker. And in Anchorage, Alaska, from the early 1970s through the mid 1980s, Robert viciously sexually assaulted, hunted, and murdered several women. Now, he was convicted and sentenced to 4 of those murders, but admitted to murdering 17 women, and I believe, and a lot of people believe, that he has even more victims than that. Now, all the information I'll be giving you in today's video came from this book right here, or is coming from this book right here, The Butcher Baker, The True Story of Robert Hansen, the Human Hunter, by Genevieve Ortiz. And I picked this book up, of course, off of Amazon. And I will put a link to this book in the description box. It's very well written, and there's tons of detail about Robert Hansen's life and his crimes. I will be giving you a lot of detail in this video, but I can't give it all to you because we'd be here for hours. So if you're interested in learning more about this case, go check out the book. I highly recommend it. It's very well written. Hard to read, but very well written. Now, the very first time I heard about this case was through a movie called Frozen Ground. It stars Nicolas Cage, John Cusack as Robert Hansen, and also Vanessa Hudgens. I had never heard of this case before that. And from what I've read about that movie, it's very close to what actually happened. And it was very well acted by all 3 of them. I mean, there's other people in the movie too, but Nicholas, John, and Vanessa really did a great job portraying this case in that movie. So if you have never seen that, I would check it out. It used to be on Netflix, I think, or maybe Amazon Prime. So as with all of my other true crime videos, I want to give a huge disclaimer here. Viewer discretion is absolutely advised. I will be detailing some very violent sexual crimes. I would not have young viewers around while you're watching or listening to this video. So without any further ado, let's get into the case of Robert Hansen, also known as the Butcher Baker. Robert Christian Bose Hansen was born on February 15th, 1939 in Estherville, Iowa, to Christian and Edna Hansen. He was the oldest of 2 children. His younger sister was born when he was around 3 years old. Now, Christian, the patriarch of the family, was very stern, very controlling, very mean, very gruff, and really ruled the household with an iron fist. And Edna, Robert's mother, was very soft-spoken, very meek, very subservient, and did whatever Christian told her to do. And she was really the only source of softness or love and affection in her children's lives. Christian never showed the children any kind of affection or love. In 1942, the family moved to Richmond, California, and that's where Robert's younger sister was born. And at first things were okay, but Christian and Edna both just did not like the fast-paced city life. So they ended up moving back to Iowa and settled in the town of Pocahontas. And at that point, that's when Christian opened the family bakery. And that bakery became a staple to the town of Pocahontas. Now, as Robert grew into his early teenage years, he was expected to work very hard at his father's bakery in the morning, before school, after school, and on the weekends, to the point where Robert's schoolwork really started to suffer because he was working so many hours. He was actually even falling asleep in class. But Christian didn't care. That was what he expected Robert to do at a very young age, like 11, 12, 13, was work tirelessly at the family bakery. Now, around this time, his early adolescence, Robert developed a very severe stutter, and that was very embarrassing to his father. So Christian would tease Robert mercilessly about his stutter, and also the kids at school were teasing him horribly about his stutter. So he learned at a very young age to just be quiet. He wouldn't speak unless he absolutely had to. Now, as he grew into his teenage years and off to high school, he also developed severe acne, and his face became horribly scarred from that acne, and those scars would last for his entire life. His father would tease him about that. The kids at school would tease him about that. And according to Robert, the girls in his high school were the worst. They would tease him all the time about his speech, about his appearance. And so Robert became a very isolated loner. His father also would never let him participate in the normal teenage activities. So he was never able to like go and goof off with his friends. It was just work, school, work, school. So that isolated him even more from his peers. He was also in choir. That was one thing his father would allow him to do, and the kids would tease him about that. And Christian really wanted Robert to be an athlete. Robert tried out for a couple sports and just had no aptitude for it. So in Christian's eyes, Robert was a complete failure. Now, Robert did try to date here and there when he was in high school, but like I mentioned, according to him, the girls were just vicious to him. So his dating life wasn't successful at all. In 1957, Robert graduated from high school and joined the Army Reserves and was stationed in New Jersey. And his very first sexual experience was on a weekend trip to New York City with his reserve buddies. They would often do that. And he solicited the services of a sex worker. Now, this was very dichotomous for him because Robert was raised in a household where his father would bash sex work all the time. His father was very religious. I mean, Robert had been raised going to the Lutheran church every Sunday without fail. So, of course, Robert had heard his whole life that sex work was an abomination. It was evil, awful, horrible. But Robert has an attraction to sex workers, and because no women were really interested in him, he had to pay for sex, which made him very angry that he had to pay for sex from a sex worker that he had been taught his whole life was evil. And Robert also felt this intense rage towards sex workers because he felt like they were in control of the whole sexual act. You know, they got to determine how much they were going to get paid and what they did, and that made Robert very angry. So it kind of created this very bizarre juxtaposition in his brain of being attracted to sex workers, but then also loathing, hating, and despising sex workers. After 2 years in the Army Reserves, Robert ended up moving back to Pocahontas, Iowa, and began working for his father again at their bakery, and began dating a really nice young woman by the name of Phoebe, who he met at their local Lutheran church. And Christian and Edna were thrilled because Robert really had never had a girlfriend up to this point, and they really wanted their son to like settle down and get married and start having children. And so yeah, they met and started dating and fell in love. And everything to the outside world seemed great. Like Robert and Phoebe looked like just this normal couple. But underneath the surface, Robert's anger and hatred was just boiling and simmering at the surface, and he decided to take matters into his own hands. So unbeknownst to anyone, he and a few of his friends decide to enact revenge from all the bullying and teasing that they'd endured when they were in high school and light the local bus barn on fire that was right next to the high school. And they'd had this practice run a few months prior in a neighboring town. They'd like blew up a tractor. So Robert and his friend break into the bus barn very early one morning in December of 1960 and light it on fire. And just so happens there's a teacher at the high school early that morning doing some lesson plans, and he sees the bus barn light on fire, so he instantly calls the police. Of course, an investigation ensues, and pretty quickly they track down Robert's accomplice in the bus barn fire, and he just sings like a canary. He says, yeah, it was Robert Hansen and I, and it was really Robert's idea. I just was kind of along for the ride, and he feels this intense need to enact vengeance on the people who teased him and bullied him in high school, so he felt like this was the perfect way to do that. So the police go and arrest Robert, charge him with arson, and then release him, awaiting a court date. So Robert decides at this time to marry Phoebe. because he's thinking that the courts will have mercy on him if he's a married man trying to start a family. And it kind of works and kind of doesn't, because he is convicted of arson, and initially he is sentenced to 3 years in prison. And not long after he enters into prison, Phoebe divorced him. She was horribly embarrassed and was like, no way. And also, Christian and Edna are so horribly embarrassed that they up and move to Minnesota. And I'll get more into detail about that here in just a minute. So while Robert is in prison, this is the first time that a psychologist really analyzes him. And at first, Robert is very open and very candid with the psychologist about his feelings towards women, how much he hates them, especially sex workers, but I mean, women in general, all the bullying, all the teasing that he'd endured, about his stutter, about his acne, about his appearance in general, that he was never manly enough in the eyes of his father, just goes into detail about his life. And the psychologist diagnoses Robert with multiple personality disorders, and at his first parole hearing says, do not let him out. He needs to be here for the entire 3 years of his sentence. Now, Robert's like, oh, well, then I'm not going to say one more word to the psychologist about anything that I'm thinking or feeling. So he basically just clams up. He's a model prisoner, does all the things he's supposed to do, but no longer engages in any kind of discussion at all with the psychologist. And in 1963, he was released from prison. So by the time he was sentenced to the time he was let out, he only served roughly about 18 months to 2 years. Upon his release from prison, he decides to move to Minnesota to be with his family. Now, Christian has purchased the Stony Point Resort near Leech Lake in Minnesota, and is basically just like the resort director. So he puts Robert to work, I want to say in the kitchen, baking at that time. And Robert absolutely loves being in Minnesota because he's really into being in the outdoors. He loves to hunt. He loves to fish. He becomes a real avid hunter and fisherman while living in Minnesota. And not long after he settled in Minnesota, he meets Darla, who is one of the cabin cleaners at the resort. And they hit it off right away. Darla was very tall, very awkward, had also been very bullied and teased and ostracized throughout her youth. And so she and Robert really bond over that and start dating, fall in love, and eventually they get married. And of course, once again, to the outside world, everything looks wonderful. Robert's straightened his act up. He's married. He's working for his father, normal American family. But behind the scenes, Robert's rage and hatred is still right at the surface. And he basically becomes a kleptomaniac. He starts stealing from everything, everywhere, and gets caught several times and gets arrested several times. And I do believe he served a little bit of jail time here and there, but always had an excuse as to why he was stealing. Very commonly is able to worm his way out of any kind of real punishment. But his behavior is again a source of embarrassment to Christian and Edna, his parents. So in the late 1960s, Robert and Darla decide to move to Anchorage, Alaska. Robert feels that this is like the perfect fresh start for them. And also Robert really likes the terrain. There's tons of outdoor areas to go and explore and hunt and fish. So shortly after they settle in Anchorage, Alaska, Robert becomes a cake baker and decorator at Safeway, and then Darla becomes a teacher. And they just really put down roots in their community. Darla gives birth to both of their children. Robert is a very active community member. He's got a lot of friends, close friends, who he goes and hunts and fishes with. And once more, from the outside world, they look just like the normal, loving, typical American family. But again, behind closed doors, Robert is a completely different person than what most people know him as. He is very aloof and very distant from Darla, and really has absolutely nothing to do with raising his children. Darla is everything to these children. Robert shows them no affection and no love, just like his father had done with him. I mean, it's basically like Robert and Darla have become Christian and Edna. And sadly, in the early 1970s, is when it's believed that Robert began his criminal career. He just had so much anger and so much rage and so much hatred towards women that he just could not contain it anymore. And it's believed that his first criminal act against a woman was in December of 1971. At least that's the earliest crime that they can figure out of Robert's. And at that point, he had seen an 18-year-old girl like around town and decided to follow her to her apartment complex. She gets out of her car, he gets out of his car with a pistol in his hand and tries to abduct her, like pull her into his car and take off with her. But fortunately, her roommate looks out the apartment window and sees him trying to abduct her and screams for her roommate and distracts Robert. He panics, gets in his car and takes off. The girl comes in and they call the police. And she does an amazing job describing Robert to a T, and they catch up with him and see that he's got a gun in his car and they arrest him. And he tells the police that he frequently suffers from blackouts and he doesn't remember what he's doing, has no control over what he's doing. And when he finally does go to court to, face these charges of attempted kidnapping, he's able to convince the judge that he didn't mean to do it, I guess. And also, Robert's appearance is so like nerdy and normal. And he's got this, stutter. He's very soft-spoken. And he just doesn't look like the typical criminal. So I also believe that that had a lot to do with why he was able to worm out of so many things as he was committing his various crimes. And so at that point, the judge just says, I'm going to release you and I want you to go and seek care, which of course he doesn't do. And in the same month, still in December of 1971, he commits his next crime. He runs into this woman at a local convenience store who had been a sex worker in the past but was no longer engaging in sex work, and abducts her, gets her into the car, makes her strip naked. He binds her hands and feet together, sexually assaults her in the car, then takes her to a local motel where he sexually assaults her again. And while this is happening, he's telling her his fantasies of taking her out into a remote area and having her run naked through the woods while he hunts her and shoots her. That's what he's telling her he's going to do to her. And she is just in a full-blown panic, and somehow is able to connect with him on a human level and convinces him to let her go. And she even writes down her name and address on a piece of paper and has him put it in his wallet as a way of proving to him that she won't go to the police. You know where I live, so why would I go to the police? I'm scared of you. I won't say a word. And he lets her go. He takes her back to her car that was left running, by the way, run out of gas, of course, by this point. And she goes home, doesn't say a word to anybody that this has happened, until not long after, same exact month in December of 1971, there's a story in the local newspaper and of course on the news about this 18-year-old girl named Celia Van Zanten, who was found naked, bound by the wrists, and left to die in a ravine in a state park in Anchorage, Alaska. And this woman had this horrible stab wound in her chest and succumbed to the elements, basically. And it's just sounded so much to the woman that he'd abducted, that he'd let go. It sounded so much like what Robert had threatened that he was going to do to her, that she's just I gotta do something. I can't let this go on because he's going to continue to do this and do this and do this and do this. So she calls the police and she says, I really think I know who could have murdered Celia Van Zanten, because I was also abducted, I think by the same man. And I've got to talk to somebody. I gotta tell you guys what happened here. So they go and they interview Robert, and he admits to taking this woman that he'd let go, and he has the slip of paper in his wallet with her name and address on it, but does not confess at all to the murder of Celia Van Zanten. And at this time, the police don't think these two things are connected at all. So Robert goes to court, pleads guilty to the attempted abduction and sexual assault of the woman that he'd let go, and ends up getting sentenced to 5 years in prison, of which he serves 6 months. And upon his release from prison after 6 months is when he really delved into his criminal behavior. On July 7th of 1973, Robert abducted and murdered 17-year-old Megan Siobhan Emmerich in Seward, Alaska, which is a town neighboring Anchorage. She was last seen leaving the laundry room of the boarding house that she was living in. She was missing for 3 days until her roommate finally called and reported her missing. Now, Robert has never admitted to killing Megan, but it was proven that he was in Seward, Alaska at the time of her disappearance. And later on, when he was finally incarcerated for his heinous crimes, he was heard bragging to his fellow inmates that he had kidnapped Megan, sexually assaulted her, taken her out into an isolated area, stripped her naked, and then forcibly hunted her, shooting her and dumping her body in a remote area. Sadly, her body has never been found. On July 5th of 1975, Robert abducted and murdered 22-year-old Mary Kathleen Thill. She was last seen that afternoon at a waterfall near her house on Lowell Point Road. Now, he has never admitted to police that he murdered her, but again, was heard bragging to his fellow inmates that he'd done the exact same thing to her that he'd done to his first victim, and then dumped her body in a shallow grave near Resurrection Bay, and her body has also never been recovered. And strangely, shortly after he committed that crime, he was arrested for stealing a chainsaw out of a local hardware store and was sentenced to a few years in prison. Actually, I think he got sentenced to more time in prison for stealing a chainsaw than he did for his abduction and sexual assault of the woman who he'd let go, who called the police. But again, was let out early from prison because of his normal appearance and the fact that he was, a model prisoner while he was incarcerated. And basically, as soon as he was released from prison, he just started right back into his horrible, violent criminal behavior. And on May 19th of 1980, he met 24-year-old sex worker Joanna Messina out for dinner in Seward, Alaska, where he, of course, solicited her services for sex work. And when they were finished, he would not pay her and would not let her out of the car. He ended up taking her to an isolated area near the Snow River, where he sexually assaulted her and then shot her to death, dumping her body in a gravel pit. Her body was later found horribly decomposed a couple months later. On June 28th of 1980, he murdered his next victim, 24-year-old sex worker Roxanne Eastlin. She was living at the budget motel with her boyfriend, making ends meet through sex work, and she just vanished out of thin air. Nobody knows what happened to her, but it's strongly suspected that Robert murdered her, and sadly, her body has also never been found. On July 21st of 1980 was when the remains of Robert's very first victim were found. Now, it's believed that she was either a sex worker or a dancer at a strip club, based on what Robert told the police. He abducted her, murdered her, and left her in a shallow grave near South Ecletna Road. But they've never been able to positively identify her. So she's been known as Ecletna Annie this whole time. They're still looking into who she could possibly be and really hoping to finally identify her. They think that she may have come from Kodiak, Alaska, but there's also some reports that she may have come to Alaska from California. On September 6th of 1980, Robert abducted and murdered 41-year-old nightclub dancer Lisa Futrell. When she didn't come home from work that night, her roommates reported her missing, and her body wasn't found for 4 years. They located her body in a shallow grave near the Knik Arm Bridge, and Robert admitted to abducting her, sexually assaulting her, taking her out near the Knik River, Knik Arm Bridge, and forcibly hunting her, shooting her, and then burying her there. On November 17th of 1981, Robert was able to lure 23-year-old sex worker Sherry Morrow out into the middle of nowhere with promises that he would pay her $300 to take nude photographs of her. This was a new tactic that he had developed. He would promise these young women $300 for sex work, and also to take nude pictures of them that they could sell to try to get into the adult entertainment business. So he takes Sherry out near the Kinnick River, sexually assaults her, strips her naked, and then forcibly hunts her, shooting her 3 times with his hunting rifle. Now, when her body was found, what was interesting is that there were no bullet holes in her clothing. So it was obvious that she had been naked, shot, then redressed, and then buried. And like I mentioned, that was becoming the habit of his, was to pay these young women $300, take them out into the middle of nowhere, strip them, sexually assault them, murder them, redress them, and bury them. On December 2nd of 1981, he did the exact same thing to 24-year-old Andrea Mona, known as Fish Altieri, because she wore this beautiful fish necklace. The last time she was seen was getting into a taxi heading down to the mall to meet Robert Hansen so that she could get $300 from him and he could take nude photos of her. He did the exact same thing, took her out into the middle of nowhere, stripped her, sexually assaulted her, hunted her, and then shot her with his hunting rifle, and then buried her in a shallow grave. And again, on May 26th of 1982, he met 23-year-old sex worker Sue Luna in a parking lot in Anchorage, Alaska, promising her $300 to take nude photographs of her, took her out into a remote wooded area, stripped her, sexually assaulted her, forcibly hunted her, shot her, and buried her in a shallow grave. And finally, in April of 1984, 2 years after her murder, her badly decomposed body was found. In March of 1983, he abducted and murdered 22-year-old Delynn Frey. Same exact thing. Abducted her, took her out to the wooded area near the Kinnick River, sexually assaulted her, hunted her, and shot her to death. She was found actually in a sandbar near the Kinnick River. And it took 7 years for her body to be identified. And how it was identified is an Alaska state trooper happened to be looking through the evidence and came upon some pictures that they had taken of Delynn's jewelry. And through the arrest that he'd made of her due to her sex work, he recognized her jewelry and was finally able to positively identify her, like I said, 7 years after she was murdered. Another thing that Robert would do, part of his MO when he would abduct these women, is he had his pilot's license and owned a very small plane. So commonly when he would abduct these women, he would put them onto his like little 2-seater plane and fly them out into the middle of nowhere near the Kinnick River, where he would sexually assault, hunt, and then shoot them to death. For example, he did that to 30-year-old Paula Goulding in April of 1983. He abducted her, forced her onto his plane, flew her out to the middle of nowhere, sexually assaulted her, stripped her naked, forcibly hunted her, and then shot her to death. Now, she wasn't found until September of 1983. And same exact situation. They found her buried with her clothes on, no bullet holes. So they knew that this was all starting to tie together, that some man was abducting these women, taking them out into the middle of nowhere, shooting them while they were naked, then redressing them before he would bury them. And once again, in July of 1983, Robert abducted and murdered 19-year-old Robin Pelkey. Now, her remains were found in Palmer, Alaska, near Horseshoe Lake. And up until 2021, Robin was nicknamed Horseshoe Harriet. They had no way of identifying her. But through extensive genealogy testing, finally, like I mentioned, in 2021, she was identified as 19-year-old Robin Pelkey. He also abducted, sexually assaulted, hunted, and murdered 4 other women: 28-year-old Malay Larson, 22-year-old Teresa Watson, 24-year-old Angela Lynn Fettern, and 20-year-old Tamara Peterson. All of them were either sex workers or exotic dancers, and the exact same MO. He would abduct them, take them out into the middle of nowhere, strip them, sexually assault them, forcibly hunt them, and then murder them, leaving their bodies in the wilderness. But what finally got Robert arrested, charged, and convicted and sent to prison was the crime that he committed against 17-year-old sex worker Cindy Paulson in June of 1983. Robert had seen Cindy dancing at a nightclub in Seward, Alaska, and decided to lure her in with the promise of $300 for him to take naked photos of her. So she accepts, gets into his car, and at this point he takes her to his home, which was something that he'd done a few other times with his other victims. He would have Darla and the kids leave, like go on like a vacation or a trip to visit her family or what have you, and he'd have the house all to himself. And he had this like man cave in the basement of his house, covered in all of the trophies, like the animal heads of all the hunting expeditions that he'd been on. I think I mentioned he was an avid hunter, had won awards for hunting. So he had this whole man cave set up with all this hunting stuff everywhere. So he takes Cindy down into the basement and viciously sexually assaults her, strips her naked, and handcuffs her and chains her to a pole in the basement and leaves her there overnight while he just falls asleep on the couch. So while she's sitting there, she's studying everything around her, like taking mental photographs of everything she can see of this room. The next morning, early the next morning, he wakes up, viciously sexually assaults her again, then unchains her from the pole but leaves her handcuffed, naked, stuffs her back into his car, and takes her out to the Merrill airfield where he has his little plane. And as he's trying to load up the plane, she says, fuck it, and takes a run for it. And naked, handcuffed. He'd also beaten her up. I mean, he viciously assaulted her. So she takes off down the road and flags down this truck driver. He picks her up. She's hysterical. I can't even imagine what he was thinking was going on. And she convinces him to take her to a hotel in Seward, Alaska. So she goes to this hotel and she's hysterical. She's handcuffed, she's naked, she's been beaten, sexually assaulted. And, you know, Robert was taunting her the whole time, telling her exactly what was going to happen, that he was going to take her out into the woods, you know, and hunt her and murder her. So the person working at the front desk at the hotel calls the police, and the police come to interview Cindy. Now, initially, she's like, I'm not telling the police anything. They're not going to believe me. They never believe me. I mean, that's very common. Most often with sex work, if a sex worker tries to report any kind of crime, especially a sexual assault, the police are like, oh, yeah, right. And they don't listen to him. And Cindy's story was pretty outlandish. You know, she's describing Robert Hansen, who the police know who he is, describing everything that he'd done to her. And they're thinking, what? No way. But also thinking, nah, this sounds maybe like we need to look into this a little bit more. Also, there was a motorist that happened to be driving by at the same time that Cindy took off to get to the truck and witnessed this whole thing and called the police and, you know, reported what he'd seen, Robert's car, the license plate number, the plane, Robert's, what he looked like, all that stuff. So they're like, okay, we need to look into this. So they go to Robert's house and interview him. And at first he's pretty calm and just like, whatever. But they asked to go look in his basement, and then he starts getting kind of loud and pissed and what do you guys think you're doing? And eventually they get a search warrant, and they're searching, and they can't find anything to like really conclusively tie him to Cindy until finally they find this bag, and I believe they found it in his attic, like in the fiberglass siding of the wall in the attic. They pull this bag out, and there is a lot of jewelry that belonged to the victims that they found, including Andrea Altieri's fish necklace and several other victims' jewelry. They found bullets that exactly matched the shell casings that were found at the murder scene. I also believe they found his hunting rifle too, I want to say. And not only that, they found a map, a murder map, all folded up in this bag that had X's marked off in all of the places that he had dumped the bodies after he'd, you know, sexually assaulted, hunted, murdered, and dumped. He'd marked X's on this map. So they're like, okay, we have all the proof we need to finally tie him to these murders. So they charge him but only charged him with 4 murders, even though he admitted to 17, which I don't really understand why that was the case. Also, I want to mention that as the police were investigating the various murder scenes here, the remains that they were finding and whatnot, they enlisted the help of FBI profiler John Douglas. Now, if you guys have ever watched the show Mindhunter on Netflix, that's loosely based off John Douglas, because the police were pretty convinced that the same man was committing all these murders. I mean, same MO, same everything. And when John Douglas put that profile together, it absolutely matched Robert Hansen to a T. Like from his childhood all the way on up to his arrest. I mean, it was uncanny how right on the money John Douglas's profile was of Robert Hansen. Unreal. I think it was one of the most accurate profiles that has ever been created from an FBI profiler of a serial killer. So Robert goes to court, pleads guilty, and gets convicted, and is sentenced to 461 years in prison. Now, he died in August of 2014 at age 75 due to natural causes at a correctional institution in Alaska. Now, of course, I'm going to give you my 2 cents about this case, as I do in every video. Here we have another situation where this man is showing clear signs that he is violent and nothing gets done about it. And I think what can happen commonly too is that people will see someone's outward appearance. You know, he was very meek, very quiet, very nerdy looking. And I think they just didn't believe he had it in him to commit crimes like this. I mean, reading the book, the investigators, a lot of them were shocked that it was Robert Hansen. Shocked, because he just didn't come off like somebody that would behave this way. And I think a lot of it too is when he was younger and stuff, I think people kind of felt sorry for him, because I don't think it was a secret to the community that Christian was not kind to Robert. I mean, I don't know. Based on what I read, I don't think that's the case. So I think there was a level of like feeling sorry for him and just utter disbelief that he would behave this way. But I mean, showed clear signs that he was so violent. And again, we have another example of zero proactivity. It's all very reactive. And also, they never had him like complete his like sentencing in the past, you know, like gets sentenced to years, he serves a few months, gets let out early for model behavior. I mean, I don't know. It just is so frustrating. And another thing that's so frustrating is that we have another example of women who are sex workers being murdered over and over and over again. And I don't think the investigation really got going until, I mean, yes, they were investigating it and stuff, but there were just a lot of signs that pointed to Robert Hansen that I think people just weren't looking at because they don't care. Sex work, women that engage in sex work, it's just not seen as that. Nobody cares, you know, they just don't investigate it. They're human beings. Whether people agree with what they do for a living, I don't care. They're human beings. They have families. They had lives, you know, I mean, duh, that seems very obvious. But I think the society, the world that we live in, they don't care. I think that's changing in some ways. I think, but I mean, is it ever going to completely change? Probably not. I mean, just the attitude alone of how the police treated Cindy Paulson when they first started interviewing her, I was so furious. I was like, and how afraid she was, because she knew she felt like they weren't going to believe her. And at first they didn't believe her. I mean, you know, it's just so awful. I just, my goal in doing these types of videos is to remember the victims and to give the victims a voice. I understand that I do focus a lot, primarily on the perpetrator of the crimes. I mean, I want to give you the case, but it's just really important to me that these victims get remembered, because they were beautiful, bright lights here on this earth and were snuffed out by this monster. And I'm glad he's passed away. It angers me, however, and I know how this is going to sound, and I'm just going to say this, I'm being honest. It angers me that he gets to live until he's 75 years old and die from natural causes in prison, but yet he wreaked so much violence and horror in the world. It's really too bad. It's awful. So on that note, let me know if you have ever heard of this case before watching this video. You can share anything you'd like in the comment section. I will say that there are times often in these videos where I make mistakes, and I absolutely welcome and appreciate anyone who wants to correct me. I will pin your comment, or, I've pinned several comments where people are correcting me. I'm totally fine with that. All I ask is that you do it respectfully. I've had some people get really nasty to me in the comment section because I've made some mistakes here and there. And, I'm an amateur, and I do the best I can to take my notes and keep as close to what I'm finding out about the case as I possibly can. But I'm human, and I'm going to make mistakes. So again, you're more than welcome to correct me. Just if you can do it respectfully, I'd really appreciate it. So hopefully I'll see you in the next month or two with another True Crime Sunday video. But in the meantime, I want you to take very good care of yourself. Be safe. Thank you guys so much for taking time out of your lives to watch these videos, because I know it's not easy to get through these. And I will see you soon.